Before we start our next session, I'm delighted to be able to read out a letter that we received last week from Nancy Reagan. To all of you, my dear friends, please accept my apologies for not attending your special event. Despite the distance between us, I have no trouble imagining the importance of today's celebration by recalling my last visit as First Lady to the Guildhall. It was June 1988, after our historic trip to Moscow, when my husband returned to this historic hall to deliver a speech in praise of freedom and in gratitude to those who, like each of you, dedicated their lives to the cause of liberty. Looking back, I remember what my husband said when he first met Margaret Thatcher. They agreed on three things. First, they placed the same high value on freedom. Second, they supported the belief that only a limited government can truly protect freedom. And finally, they agreed they would always get their work done to be home in time for dinner. As an aside, I think that might be true of Ronald Reagan. I'm not quite so sure if Dennis Thatcher would agree. I continue from Nancy Reagan. Their strength, their candor became part of a great strategy once they found the will and held fast to the faith. And like you, they believed the eventual triumph of freedom would not come without sacrifice and diligence. Thank you for continuing the crusade for liberty, and please know my heart is with you every step of the way. Sincerely, Nancy Reagan. And this leads us on to our next panel. After America, what?
Tim, thank you very much indeed. My name is Michael Clarke. I'm the director of the Royal United Services Institute, the oldest military think tank in the world, established by the Duke of Wellington in 1831. And today is our Founders' Day, which is the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, 18th of June. And it's a delight for me to be asked to chair this session with our three very distinguished speakers. We're concerned here with the exam question of the title, After America What?, which of course is another way of talking about the way we think the world will look, primarily in economic and social terms, as much or more than in military terms. And I'm delighted that we have three excellent conversationalists to start us off this afternoon. I'm going to ask each of them to offer us their headline points for 5 minutes each, and then we'll throw it open to a more general discussion, and I will abuse the position of the chair by throwing in my own questions as I feel them come upon me. But I'd like to introduce our first speaker who's General David Petraeus, a man I'm sure who needs no introduction to an audience such as this. General Petraeus served 37 years in the US military. He corrected me earlier on that I'd said that 4 of his last 5 commands were combat commands. In fact, it was 5 of his last 6 commands in the military were combat commands, which is unique by any standards. And they covered Iraq, CENTCOM, the Central Command, and of course Afghanistan. He was then director of the CIA, and he is now working for KKR, and he is the head of the Global Institute at KKR, which is concerned with forward-thinking and thought leadership in matters of global stability and economic development. So, General David, let me ask you to start with a few comments that I know you've harbored for a little while.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. Thanks for all that you do with such a steady hand at the helm of RUSI, a wonderful organization, and I might add that we just came from there. It's really a privilege to be reunited with Prime Minister Howard. He was, in a sense, one of my wartime prime ministers. We had Australian forces in Iraq for 2 of the commands while I was there, and I remember his steadfast support of that mission, and I remain grateful to him for it. And it's obviously great to be here with another expert on the world and on China in particular, Dr. Jin. In responding to the question, after America, what? I have a fairly simple answer, which is I will then add a bit of nuance to. But after America comes North America, and I will explain that thesis in a second. Now, don't get me wrong. Clearly, China is going to continue to grow and develop. You know, it has been providing 1/3 of the growth of the world for at least the last decade. It does indeed face a very pivotal moment, addressing a number of considerable challenges, everything from transitioning from the low-cost labor in the world, no longer the case, diminishing returns from infrastructure investment and diminishing returns from moving people from the country to urban areas. Each of those has been one of the important pillars of the growth dynamic in China. President Xi so far charting a very skillful course in dealing with those issues, as well as dealing with the large debt to GDP ratio, the largest in the world, dealing with the corruption issues, state-owned enterprise issues, wealth management products, some of which are insolvent and so forth. But having, again, pointed out those challenges, I would add again that President Xi and his team have done a truly admirable job, and we have every expectation that they will continue to do that. China will, therefore, continue to grow. The world undoubtedly, obviously, will become increasingly multipolar, having had this unique unipolar period for a while with the U.S. as the sole and unchallenged superpower in the world. But as we do look forward, we should perhaps reflect on the course that I teach. I'm a professor at the Honors College of the City University of New York. I did have an academic part to my life way back before, while in uniform. And the title of this course is The Coming North American Decades. It started out last semester, the first semester I taught it. It was titled, Are We on the Threshold of the North American Decades? ? I threw that away, threw away the question mark, and boldly proclaimed The Coming North American Decades as the title now. It's founded on recognition that if you put these three economies together, as has been the case 20 years into the North American Free Trade Act implementation, you find unique countries in terms of demographics. China also faces a demographic downturn. Japan, a huge downturn. Much of Europe, not so with those three countries. You see shared values, free market capitalism, liberal democracy, generally good in security terms, the rule of law challenges in Mexico notwithstanding. But the prospects there in certain regards are enormous because there are 4 revolutions that are ongoing. They are ongoing really in various levels in each of the 3 countries, but foremost in the United States. The energy revolution is the first of those. This has created the biggest change in energy geopolitics, perhaps geopolitics period, since 1973, the rise of China being actually the first, I think. This has now propelled the United States into the largest gas producer in the world, natural gas, something which gives us an incredible comparative advantage. We pay $4.70 or so for a million BTU. Japan pays $18. China pays somewhere around 10 to 12, depending on the contract. Europeans, again, somewhere in that 9 to 12 range as well. You cannot overcome that if you're in the petrochemical industry, and they've all come to the United States. It gives enormous advantages in other regards as well. We also have a revolution that, with the shale oil also, and we may well be the #1 producer of oil in a few years. And then if you lump together Canada, which has had its own energy revolution, it's still going on, and Mexico, which is likely on the eve of its energy revolution with the one of the major reforms ushered in by the President Peña Nieto administration, hugely impressive. 16 of these, by the way, more than all 3 of his predecessors in their 18 years in government combined. You see a country, again, that is poised for enormous increases in productivity, although they will take years, not months, and in some cases may actually take a generation, as with education reform. But the energy revolution there could be quite substantial as Pemex opens up now that market to the oil majors and to international companies. Beyond the energy revolution, you have the revolution that enabled the energy revolution, the IT revolution, because the third element in the energy revolution, which consists of directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing of shale, is the IT revolution. The big data piece of this, and combined with seismic technology, is what enables those seeking deposits in shale to find it and then to stay in it as they carry out their extraction. The IT revolution has massive consequences elsewhere. Again, many pockets of goodness around the world, but I think not arguable that the biggest is in Silicon Valley and a variety of other centers in the United States. This establishes the conditions for the manufacturing revolution, which is going to have sweeping effects, not just for industry, but for societies. Because where we used to need 100 people on an assembly line, now we'll have 2 people that will be supervising 100 or 200 robots. This is truly coming soon to a theater near you. It is actually taking place now. I was at a conference yesterday in Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT is among the leaders in this field, and some of what they showed us was truly breathtaking to behold, and breathtaking in its implications, again, for workforces and the way they need to be educated in the future and so forth. And then you have the life sciences revolution. This is a bit more nascent, but what will be done in terms of genetics, personalized medicine, and a variety of other initiatives in that field also has truly profound implications. Now, I don't want to sound over bullish about this. The United States, that element of the North American continent, which, by the way, you also lump this together, it's a market of nearly 500 million people. But the United States faces numerous challenges. We do have to get immigration reform. We've got to address certain needs in the education arena, infrastructure, debt to GDP, a host of different challenges, some of the gridlock in Washington, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that these forces being unleashed by these 4 revolutions in particular, with all 3 countries as highly integrated as they are, keeping in mind that the 2 largest trading partners for the United States are not the number 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 economies in the world. They're modest-sized. Canada is number 1, and then Mexico, at least in one category, it's 2 and 3 with China. So the implications here, as I said, are really quite dramatic, and I think they really do allow you at least to argue that after America comes North America. Thanks very much.
General David, thank you. That puts into some perspective the declinism arguments that we've lived with for the last few years. And the revolutions that General David is talking about, energy, IT, life sciences, all these are powerful things. Let's move on to our second speaker, conversationalist, who is Keyu Jin, from the doctorate at the LSE. She was born in Beijing. She was educated, among other places, in Harvard. She is a macroeconomist concerned with finance, in particular concerned with the economy of China. And Keyu, we asked you to give us some reflections on where China is going economically and socially whilst we think about the new American decade.
Great, thank you. In General Petraeus' talk, he seemed almost a bit apologetic whenever he raised some challenges to whether China would really become a global powerhouse. And I have to say I completely agree with you that there are significant challenges. And in fact, I think most Chinese would agree with you as well. We just have to look at some facts. Now, in China, we never talk about a post-America world order. We don't even fathom the possibility of that occurring in our lifetime. We certainly don't talk about a Chinese global dominance. The discussion is still very much, or the attitude is still very much, when can we catch up? When can we earn the respect from the rest of the world? The Chinese are still very much licking the wounds from the past of shame, of being so poor for so long, and having been bullied around by the kind of powers that be historically. So the Chinese think it's a loss of face to have been poor. And right now, it's more about catching up. Very few discussions about overtaking, right? But if we just look at the rest of the world, the perspective on China is very different. Now, about a month ago, the Financial Times put up a headline of China poised to pass US as world's leading economic power this year. This is misconceived, and in fact, it's mismeasured. We just have to look at the facts. The facts will remind us that China is still a poor country. It's a developing country. Now, it brings to the second point of what is, if we broaden the notion of what it really means to be a global economic powerhouse, what do we really mean? What are the meaningful and critical criterion against which these countries can be judged? It's certainly not just the notional size of a country, okay? Especially when the country is big, when the size of the economy is big because it has 1.3 billion people. Now, let's come back to some raw facts. Now, the numbers that are used typically to describe why China might overtake the US or it will catch up with the US is GDP converted based on purchasing power parity, PPP, exchange rate-based GDP. Okay, that's what they use to measure that China is going to catch up. That is the wrong metric to use. We only use PPP-adjusted exchange rates when we're talking about the standards of living of an individual, right? Because the income per capita based on PPP measures is important because you have to take into account of some countries being poorer than others, some countries' prices being lower than others. But it is not the right metric to use to discuss the weight of an economy in the world. You should use market-based exchange rates, okay? And if we use market-based exchange rates, the US's GDP is almost about twice as large as China's. And so that means that even if China grows at 5 percentage points faster than the US, okay, it will take another 12 years, if exchange rates don't change much, to catch up. Okay? Using the right metric of GDP and global weight, China has still a lot of time before it can actually catch up to the US. And then we come back to the real fundamental metric of what it means what economic prosperity and welfare means, and that is GDP per capita, per person. Any large number divided by 1.3 billion is inevitably going to be small, right? So right now, China's per capita income, PPP adjusted even, is the same as Albania, middle of the distribution of about 200 countries. So when we talk about a real economic global power, it has to be at least the combination of the size of the economy, the notional size which China has, but also the per capita income, which is how rich is a country actually. But even beyond the combination of these two factors, which is really the first step, there are a few really critical and meaningful indicators, and this suggests that it's going to take a long time before China can actually even catch up with the reigning champion. Right? In fact, its immediate challenge right now is, can it escape the middle income trap, which many countries have seen when they have fallen into this reached this kind of income level. But to broaden the notion of what it means to really to wield economic influence, we have to consider a broad range of questions, right? So from the viewpoint of multinational companies, how big is the Chinese market? How important are Chinese multinational companies going to be themselves in the global market? From the viewpoint of global financial markets, is China going to be able to create an international financial market, allow its citizens to be able to buy stocks from around the world rather than all piling it up in bank deposits and housing and property, right? From the viewpoint of multilateral institutions, how much money can China actually contribute, and in turn, how much voting power can it get? Now, I think it's also almost ludicrous, borderline ludicrous to talk about China having a reserve currency internationally when it has a fixed exchange rate, capital controls, no real financial centers, and even more importantly, China hasn't even really figured out what kind of macroeconomic model it's trying to converge to, right? Right now, the economy is really a web of interdependent, interlinking, symbiotic, distortionary policies that cast the economy into a vicious cycle of suppressing the households, subsidizing the state-owned enterprises. Okay? The household share of income in the US is around 80% of GDP. The household income share in China has fallen from 70% to 60% over the last 10, 15 years. That's a dramatic decline. So it is finding itself hard to come out of this economic vicious cycle, macroeconomic order, and that it can't escape. So I think it's really, really too early to talk about Chinese dominance. It's also early to talk about post-America. Now, even if China does manage to resolve these medium-term economic structural problems, China will still far lag the US in many important ways, three of which is, can it actually push the world technology frontier? Right now, it's simply trying to catch up with it. Okay? Can it actually drive innovation? Second, will it be like the US, which was able to attract and retain this large amount of talent, human capital concentration? Can China do that? More importantly, there's a clear distinction between affecting the world economy simply because you're big, you have large amounts of saving, okay? You have exports and you demand imports. This distinction between affecting the world by the actions that you take and being actually able to drive the world economy is something completely different. It will take decades before that can actually happen if the Chinese government actually choose the right policies, which is still in question. Now, let me end with a story from the Qing dynasty. So, right after Lin Zexu publicly burned about 3 million pounds of opium on the shores of Canton, there was a debate in the British Parliament about whether a war should be waged against China. Now, of course, there was some opposition. Some were concerned with the size and power of the Chinese, of China. But there was a big, beautiful Chinese vase, and a gentleman, a lord of some sort, went up, took his crane, and smashed it into pieces. This is China, he said. It's big and seemingly awesome, but vulnerable and fragile, easily broken. The message we want to get out of this is not so much, let's try to flex our muscles and intimidate China, but it's more from an economic standpoint. It hasn't really figured it out yet. So I think it's still very early to talk about post-America, not the least to say a Chinese dominance. Thank you.
Keyu Jin, thank you. Keyu, thank you very much indeed. I think we all know that the 21st century is the Asian century. That's a matter of sheer demographics, for good or bad, good and bad. It is the Asian century we embark upon, but we've heard very convincingly that the United States has an economic second wind coming to it, and that China's economic development is far below the level of some of the headlines, and that we should think much more carefully about the timing with which China emerges to the sort of destiny that we think it probably has. Our third conversationalist today, I'm delighted to introduce the Honourable John Howard. He is the longest-serving Prime Minister of Australia behind Robert Menzies. He served as Prime Minister from 1996 to 2007. He won 4 successive elections, and there aren't many people who can say that they've done that. One or two that we can think of could, but not many people have won 4 successive elections, at least not honestly. And he has done that, so he's in a very small club of leaders in the world. He has spoken a great deal since he stood down on leadership, on global economic management, and he's the chairman of the International Democrat Union, and it's a great pleasure to ask him to offer some perspectives, I guess, from the Pacific on some of the ideas that we've heard. John, Mr. Howard.
Thank you very much. Can I say it's, as an Australian, it's very nice to be introduced by Michael Clarke. Michael Clarke's the Australian cricket captain. I can remind some of our audience. Can I start by saying what a real pleasure it is to be participating in this conference? and very particularly to share a platform with David Petraeus. We last met in Baghdad. He undertook the leadership of the surge which turned around the fortunes of the military operation by the coalition in Iraq, and it is a matter of regret to me, and I'm sure to many other people, that the fruits of that courageous and skillful operation were subsequently squandered by some very indifferent political leadership inside Iraq itself, and some other decisions which perhaps in other contexts one will come to, but it is a real pleasure to share the platform. I hope that this is not going to be one of those gatherings when the panel disappoints you because it is in furious agreement. I have to say that I shared General Petraeus's views about the extraordinary contribution that the shale revolution, if I can put it that way, in the United States has made to turning around the fortunes, not only of American manufacturing, but reminding us yet again that when it comes to getting something done in the name of greater economic growth and clearing away barriers, how good the Americans are compared with many other countries, including many countries in Europe. At the same time that the Americans are grabbing hold of this opportunity, governments in Europe are erecting barriers to cheaper energy. Witness the extraordinary decision, I regard it as extraordinary, taken by the German government in relation to nuclear power. So I do agree with that. And I also, can I say that I agree very strongly with Dr. Jin regarding the interaction, if I can put it that way, between the United States and China. There's not the slightest doubt that the relationship with between those two countries will have a greater impact on the economic and strategic outcomes facing the world in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years than any other bilateral relationship. And I have for some years now, in talks and speeches I've encouraged audiences not to be mesmerised by China, because not only is there the realistic economic comparison that we've just heard from a qualified macroeconomist between America and China, but there is also the reality that China faces two extraordinary challenges. One of them is an ageing population. China's demographics are very bad. The demographics of many European countries are very bad. The demographics of India, of course, by contrast, are very good. But China's are bad. And on top of that, eventually, in my view, China will face the great governance denouement, if I can put it that way. A middle class born with no other experience than living in the middle class is going to demand a greater say over their own political future. You may put up with being told what you have to do and what you have to believe if you transition from poverty to affluence in your lifetime, but you're not going to put up with it if affluence is something that you have always taken for granted. So I certainly share the views that she has expressed in the analysis that she's provided. There's two other points. This morning we witnessed, in the context of that great contribution from our Polish friend, along with the contribution from the Prime Minister of Estonia, we witnessed a video which showed both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and was a reminder to me, as somebody who remains interested in political communication, although my living no longer in any way depends on political communication, it reminded me of what wonderfully articulate exponents they were of fundamental political concepts. And it seems to me that the greatest thing about both of those courageous leaders was that they were people who had complete cultural self-belief. John O'Sullivan, who chaired one of the sessions, two of the sessions this morning, wrote a wonderful book called The Pope, the President and the Prime Minister. And he has a wonderful paragraph in it in which he said that there was a stage when the careers of these three wonderful people were not travelling too well. And I think I've got the pronunciation right. Vokhtova was regarded as being too Catholic. Ronald Reagan was regarded as being too American. And Margaret Thatcher was regarded as being too conservative. Now, of course, none of the three of them shifted, but the world and the circumstances of the world shifted towards them, and they, in turn, their times arrived and they coincided, and together they contributed more than any other three people to the greatest political development in my lifetime, and that is the implosion of the Soviet Empire. And it's a reminder that to political leaders of all ages, and today's nonetheless, of just how tremendously important philosophical clarity and cultural self-belief is. The West needs to recover its cultural self-belief. It needs to understand that the values of the West that we all instinctively think about when we talk about Western civilization, for all their flaws and blemishes, have been incredibly successful, and they have been responsible for repulsing assaults on liberty and for delivering the living standards and the circumstances of life of so many people. The final point I want to make is that it remains my view that Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic extremism, is a far greater threat than many people in this sort of culturally equivocal way when you talk about Islam lapse into than those people believe. I read President Obama's West Point commencement speech, which he delivered a couple of weeks ago, which, as I understand it, was meant to define current American foreign policy. And with the greatest respect to him and to an office that I hold in enormous regard, I found it a disappointingly complacent speech when it spoke of Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism. And in a world where Pakistan now is virtually a failed state, we have an incredibly chaotic situation in Iraq. We must worry, although we hope that those worries are not justified, that Afghanistan will do better than many of the critics suggest. I think it was an altogether too complacent analysis of the threat posed by Islamic terrorism, and that, of course, is an issue and a study that will consume many conferences and not just a 5-minute presentation from me. But I'll finish on that, and I hope that in the course of the next 3/4 of an hour, the three of us can find something to disagree about.
John, thank you very much indeed. You raise a couple of points which I'd like to take up immediately. The first one with Keyu, Dr. Jin. John mentioned the demographic issue for China. I mean, China will get old before it gets rich is the phrase that I don't know if Susan Shirk invented it, but she certainly used it a lot in her book. Old before it gets rich. Would you like to comment on the demographic time bomb that the Chinese seem to have?
Absolutely. I disagree with the view that China will be old before it gets rich for a few reasons. One is just looking at the numbers. The peak of aging actually happens in 2060, not right now. The reason that the demographic structure has shifted is because of the one-child policy. My generation, born post-1980s, is only going to enter into the so-called middle age only a decade or two later, and that's when the aging problem will occur. But also because the recent plenary reform in the third plenum announced the two-children policy, right? So now urban areas are going to have more than one child, so that's going to ease some of these sheer demographic, aging issues. But even putting this raw, demographic structure, labor force issues aside, I think the critical the important factor is labor productivity. That's something we don't really talk about, but that's far more important than the labor force, the number of people, and how many of the population, how much of the population is working age. If you look at the labor productivity growth in China, on average, is about 10% per year. If we're really talking about a fear of a reduction in the labor force, we're talking about maybe a 0.5 percentage slowdown in labor force or even a labor reduction. But 10% per year labor productivity is more important. So effectively, one American worker was about 6 Indian workers in 1990. And because of really rapid labor productivity growth, it was more like 1 American worker versus 2 Indian workers. So we have to take into account labor productivity.
Thank you. Interesting. And General David, you may have a comment on that, but could I also ask you to address the question of cultural self-belief? That's been on the retreat recently, and events over the last few months may have increased an immediate sense of that, because critical, I think, intrinsic to a lot of what you said, as John Howard makes clear, the cultural self-belief is partly the prerequisite to making the most of everything else that may be going for the United States at the moment.
Well, first of all, on the issue of labor productivity, it's a hugely important topic. And you see a country like Japan, which is in a real demographic decline. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. It's very significant. They did at least get rich before they got old. But at the end of the day, Prime Minister Abe has to, with his reforms, with the third arrow in the Abenomics quiver, having shot already the monetary easing and the fiscal stimulus arrows, he's got to produce enormous gains in productivity. Given the workforce going like this, productivity has to go like that, or GDP goes like that. And so it's an imperative. The truth is, I think that we are on the threshold of enormous productivity increases in many of the developed countries, the US certainly among them. In fact, we have seen considerable productivity gains in the United States in recent years, and that's just with the early stages of advanced manufacturing, with the introduction of robotics, the introduction of three-dimensional printing, the introduction of vastly greater automation than we've ever had before. The challenge with that, though, is the issue of displacement of a workforce and whether we're educating the workforce of the future properly to be able to provide value added, to function in an economy that becomes increasingly automated and where the old assembly line really does go the way of the dinosaur by and large. And it's interesting because in the United States, the median income has actually stayed flat and even gone down a little bit in recent years, even though productivity has gone up. It used to be that when productivity went up, median income went up. In this case, that is not the situation. You all know, of course, the recent book that has been debated, which again, I think makes that point pretty clearly as well. Yeah, the cultural self-belief issue is obviously a big one. It's all captured with the sense of national identity. What are the national values? You know, it's interesting because in a military unit, you try to build certain qualities into that unit. As an air assault infantry battalion commander, you know, we work very hard on physical and mental toughness. I'm talking very, very hard on that. On the issues of discipline, of certain tactical capabilities and so forth, and it becomes a culture. And you're building this culture. And I think that it is fair to challenge, again, are we embarked on reinforcing the cultures of our countries in a proper way, and indeed examining them through the prism of great leaders like Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan.
Okay, let me throw it open to some general comments now. We can take questions. If you feel inclined to tweet, we will record your tweets and we'll feed them in as questions. But if anybody would like to raise a question, you may now start to think about it. There's one that has come in via tweet, which I think relates exactly to what General David was just saying. Somebody in effect said, is America more threatened by its own political divisions? Is there a danger that we will see a very strong American society and economy with a very weak American government? Is that conceivable? And is that one of the greatest threats to American national security as well as prosperity?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's always worth putting this into perspective. The United States has a history of thinking that the good old days really were good old days. The truth is there's a reason that John Adams would only communicate with Thomas Jefferson through his wife Abigail. And it was because the divisions between these two great men, the two of the founding fathers as they're termed, that relationship had become so toxic that Adams cut off relations with his fellow founding father after being virulently criticized in newspapers that Jefferson used as a front, which he controlled. He tried to be in the shadows on this, but nonetheless was the one orchestrating the attacks. And we should recall that, you know, our nation literally had a civil war over some of the divisions at the time, and of course in the mid-19th century. But clearly the gridlock, which brought about the shutting down of our government, for goodness sake, and has prevented coming to grips with some of these challenges that I identified, like the need for comprehensive immigration reform, like the need to tackle what are we going to do about entitlements if right now the debt to GDP ratio is going in the right direction, but in a few years it's projected to start going back up. How do we come to grips with that? Where should we invest in infrastructure and how should we do it? And above all, I think the most important issue of all has to do with how we need to make changes in our education system so that all Americans have an opportunity for a great education and not just those that have certain advantages of birth. If I could, I would want to add one item to what I was talking about earlier, because it does bring you back to, I think, some pretty extraordinary qualities that my country has. And if you look at why we are enjoying the so-called shale gale right now, this unconventional gas and oil that comes from rock, shale rock, very tight. It's way, way down below the surface, very far below the water table and so forth. And there are really 7 reasons, I think, and it's worth reflecting on these reasons because they do say something about the United States and indeed about North America writ large. First of all, obviously we were blessed to have oil and gas and shale, considerable amounts of it, but China actually has vastly higher reserves. Second, we developed the technology, these 3 big components, but many subcomponents for, again, directional drilling, the ability to go horizontally so you could expose huge seams as opposed to just one seam if you're vertical. And now you can even run multiple lines off a single hole. Hydraulic fracturing of the rock so that we can extract the gas or oil. And then the seismic technology that I discussed earlier, and to do all this safely. We had capital in capital markets that could inject money into firms, and then firms were built around this technology and developed into medium-sized firms. We also have the water, because this is a water-intensive endeavor. It's one of the challenges that China faces, although there are others, again, in this area. We have property rights that enable private property owners to sell the mineral rights underneath their land. That does not exist in Australia. It does not exist in many other countries either. And then we actually had the natural gas infrastructure so that we could push gas around the country. It's not perfect. Many more final miles are needed in it, but enough so that everybody could get gas off the pipeline rather than having to have it liquefied, which adds to the cost and then transported in some other fashion. So again, there are some unique attributes here that truly are somewhat uniquely American, and again, reinforce that whole thesis that I offered up front.
Yeah. And as a result, North Korea is looking like the Klondike these days. Okay, there's a couple of questions from the audience. Sir. Okay, in case people didn't hear that, we were talking about whether immigration and impending or possible isolationism could knock this thesis sideways. Again, it's back to you, General David.
Well, first, I think I would point out that America has historically, in the wake of long or tough wars, in the wake of Korea, there was a No More Koreas movement, there was a No More Vietnams. When you have difficult, hard, costly, frustrating endeavors like Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it's reasonably understandable to do some real searching and some real examination of what should we take from that, what do we learn from it, and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, that spirit of, let's nation build at home and very attractive, but I think Americans probably are reminded again now with what's going on in the Middle East and some of the Arab Spring countries, and of course what has happened in Iraq, to see that indeed America does have to have a leading role in a number of places around the world. There is one area that I think is of particular concern at the present though, and that is because of gerrymandering. Our House of Representatives, our lower house in Congress, has really become less bipartisan, if you will, in terms of the policy divides. You have red and blue for Republicans and Democrats, the way they're usually coded. And what's happened because of the redrawing of districts is that in many of the states, not all, but there has been a tendency for the red districts to become bright red and the blue districts to become bright blue. And so the primary ends up being the more important, where the primary election, where the candidate for the Democratic or Republican seat, that's the real deciding vote. And the general election actually is a foregone conclusion because of the demographics of the district being redrawn to make it a particularly safe one for the incumbent party. That's a concern because it does make it more difficult to do what Ronald Reagan could do with Tip O'Neill when he was Speaker of the House, a Republican and a Democrat, and there was reaching across the aisle. It could be done without losing one seat back home, and I think that is a cautionary tale and a source of concern, and it really was ultimately, of course, what led to the closing of government. It's what led to the imposition of sequestration, which was designed to be so terrible that Congress would look into the abyss and draw back and come to agreement on a budget, and instead looked over and couldn't come to agreement and leapt into the abyss. So these are areas of concern. I was on a panel out at Aspen a year or so ago, and we had individuals who wouldn't necessarily all generally agree. Senator McCain, Tom Donilon had just left as the National Security Advisor to President Obama, former Secretary Gates and myself, and we all agreed that among the top 5 biggest threats to U.S. national security was Washington, D.C. So now that was at a moment where we'd had this gridlock. We've since been able to actually agree on a budget for 2 years and the deficit, raising the debt limit and all the rest of that. But this will be back. And it's something with which the United States really has to deal.
John Howard, you know a thing or two about electoral dynamics?
Yeah, could I just acknowledge that the gerrymander issue, that is particular to the United States, and I
And
followed.
Really the House.
In the House of Reps,
yeah.
you've essentially
Yeah.
got no marginal seats left.
Very few.
Very, very few marginal seats, and that is a big issue. But there's a broader issue that afflicts Britain and Australia and I guess Canada and New Zealand, other light Anglosphere democracies, and that is really a hollowing out of the membership of political parties. Political parties, certainly in my country, and I don't think it'd be different in Britain and probably not different in the US, political parties, their active memberships are now less representative of the mass of the people who vote for that party at election times. And what therefore happens is that there's a tendency on both sides to get ultra-activists who are less interested in philosophy and more interested in number crunching, more interested in taking over branches and factionalism and so forth within political parties. And I just think of what the Liberal Party of Australia was like when I joined it in the late 1950s. It had a lot of people who were just ordinary citizens who weren't trying to achieve anything for themselves, but they had a broad philosophy. Now, there's still a lot of those people in my party, but I think it's an issue that is faced in all of our democracies. People have less time now to join political parties, to go to meetings and the like, and as a result, they're more susceptible to capture by people who will push the two parties to the fringes. And I think it's fair to say that using the old left-right, you've got a Democratic Party in the United States, which in many respects is a bit more to the left. I think the current administration is a more left-wing one than the Clinton administration was, same party. I think you've seen tendencies with the Tea Party for pushing the Republican Party to the right. You always govern most effectively from the centre with a clear tilt either to the left or the right. And the successful centre-right political leaders of the last 30 or 40 years have been. I mean, Reagan was a centrist, but with a tilt to the right. Margaret Thatcher, it's a heresy to say it, I hope, at a gathering like this, she was a centrist with a tilt to the right as well. I mean, there were many things that Reagan and Thatcher kept left completely untouched that perhaps many people in this audience felt that they should have done something about, like the national health system or some of the foundations of the social welfare system. Ronald Reagan, remember, bailed out the housing and loans outfits in the early 1980s because he saw it representing a threat. So this is a modern challenge, and it's not confined to the United States, although I acknowledge the redistricting or gerrymandering issue is probably stronger in the United States than in Britain or Australia.
Thank you. I have some treaty questions, but I'm going to take a flesh and blood question first. Sir.
Depends on productivity. Again, the discussion earlier, just in sheer terms, if GDP is your measurement, GDP is a function of labor force times productivity of that labor force. And so if indeed, as you note correctly, you have the United States as a percentage of the world's workforce coming down, its productivity has to go up if it's to maintain its relative position. But I don't think that there are too many people that would argue that again, there is going to be a point where China will surpass the United States. I mean, you have 1.3 billion people. Sooner or later, if it continues on the trajectory it's on, those lines will intersect, first in terms of absolute GDP, and then the question is, can they get to GDP per capita? But at the end of the day, the capabilities that the United States has in a variety of different elements of power, if you will, of national power, are still really quite unique. I mean, there's no other country that has remotely the military, the expeditionary military capabilities in particular, obviously in certain technological areas and a variety of other places, and I think still in the diplomacy and so forth remains very much certainly the leader of its portion of the world.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one of the tweeted questions now, which is about social media, particularly the effect of social media on modern politics, but particularly the possible effects of social media on politics in China. Keyu.
That's an excellent question. I think this is where most people outside of China don't realize that the elements of democracy have already been introduced in China, and that's been evolving rather rapidly, and there is evidence that the government looks at, what we call the WeChat, the Weibo, very carefully. It follows it on a daily basis. When it makes an economic decision, economic policy decision, it goes to check on social media what is the response from the popular, majority. Issues of corruption. Why is the anti-corruption program taking on full speed? Part of the reason is that is the main issue that has been reflected, main concern of the government that's reflected by the social media. And President Xi's goal of maintaining political stability, political power, is to respond to these general concerns. So I absolutely think that we underestimate how impactful social media has been in terms of introducing a rapid improvement in democracy in China.
Thank you. Interesting. Sir. Sir, there's a microphone just on your right-hand side. That would help.
I consulted with the New York City school system, and the power of the National Union of Teachers in the United States makes it almost impossible to fire an incompetent teacher. In New York City, they have rubber rooms where the teachers go and sit because even the school accepts that they're not good enough to teach. So how would you suggest the United States solves the problem of the power of the lobbyists?
Okay, I think it's a more generic question about lobbying and special interests. General David.
Well, I mean, it's just an enormous challenge. There's just no two ways about it. And it has affected every aspect of politics, and special interests can indeed make their weight felt. It's the reason that we have subsidies in certain industries that are making tens of billions of dollars and yet still get special breaks and so forth. So it's a fact of life, and it will take very, very courageous leadership to take that on. We have seen that at local levels, and it is interesting to look at what state governors and in some cases mayors have done. Rahm Emanuel, for example, former White House chief of staff, former congressman, has taken on some of the unions in Chicago. He had a pretty bright idea, frankly, and that is that kids ought to go to school longer each year, and they should stay longer each school day. By the way, the U.S. consistently tests about a year behind academically a number of other countries, and it turns out, in part because they actually get a year's less school than do those other countries provide for their school-age kids, just because of the sheer length of the school year and the school day. That has been a big struggle for him. He's taken on some other unions. He had to take on some because of pensions that were underfunded, pension plans. You see, by the way, Governor Brown in California has taken on the redistricting issue and trying to make rational districts. And so you do see, this is back to the gerrymandering issue, you do see both mayors and governors that are attempting to tackle these issues. Mayor Bloomberg took on a number of causes, as you well know, in New York, as you recounted. One of those, even ultimately taking on the biggest of all, which was to outlaw the supersized Slurpee. I think there was limited progress in that particular battle, but the fight goes on. So, and that's what it's going to require in each of these cases. Big, big challenge.
Okay, thank you. Sir. Hang on, there's a microphone, Daniel.
Thanks. General Petraeus, everyone in this room, I'm sure, wants to know your answer to one question. This week, in the last week, the West has sustained a terrible defeat in Iraq. We want to know, in the unlikely event that the President were to summon you back into the White House and say, General, what do we do now? What should we do? What would your answer be?
Can I just say before the General answers that, we're getting a lot of questions on Twitter about that. Can we ask about that? I was going to pile them up all together for the end, but let's take that one now.
Sure.
David.
Well, if I could remind you that in the surge in Iraq, the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces, it was the surge of ideas. It was the change in strategy. From consolidating on big bases to living with the people to secure them, 77 additional locations in Baghdad alone. From transitioning, handing off to Iraqi forces as fast as we could, in truth faster than they could handle it, to stopping it completely until we could reform the units, rehabilitate them, change leaders, and then drive the level of violence down to be that they could handle. And among the biggest of all, and this was not serendipity or just sheer luck, because we'd done reconciliation even when I was a two-star in Iraq. One reason that Mosul went well when our division was there, it ultimately did not, because in fact Baghdad, the Iraqis in charge of the De-Baathification Commission, wouldn't codify the reconciliation that Ambassador Bremer had authorized us to carry out. The big idea there was that you cannot have 18 to 20% of the population feeling disenfranchised, feeling that it has no stake in the success of the country. In fact, that it has a stake in the failure of the new Iraq. And of course, we reached out to the Sunni Arabs. We had to show that we could secure them first, because no one would raise his or her hand and say, we'll take on al-Qaeda, we don't like them, until they were sure that they weren't going to get their head chopped off, which is what happened in several instances prior to the surge. And we had that one small case outside Ramadi before the surge that was sustained, but it was sustained because there were two M1 tanks parked in the front yard of the Sheikh. So we had to show that we were indeed the biggest tribe in town and secure them, and then they were willing to take on these murderous individuals who were making life so difficult for them. There were numerous initiatives as part of reconciliation, and sadly, in the last 2.5 years or so, actually last 3 years or so, some of those deals have not been supported, sustained. Agreements were allowed to lapse, and the fabric of society, which we'd worked hard with our Iraqi partners, and indeed with Prime Minister Maliki during that time, to bring it back together, having been torn apart by the near civil war of 2006 and the first few months of 2007, to get a few stitches back into that society through reconciliation, through outreach to the Sunni Arab component. By the way, also with the Shia militia extremists, because in the Sons of Iraq, ultimately, 103 or 4,000 of them, about 20 to 25,000 were actually former Shia militias with whom we'd been battling as well. And unfortunately, that architecture, those agreements, those initiatives have been undermined by sectarian actions, going after Sunni Arab political figures, and so forth, and again, failure to continue to pay salaries to certain individuals, and then quite harsh treatment of demonstrators in the wake of some of the actions that led to protests. So there has to be a huge idea here, and it has to be that if there is to be support for Iraq, it has to be support for a government of Iraq that is a government of all the people and is representative of and responsive to all elements of Iraq. President Obama has been quite clear on this. This cannot be the United States being the Air Force for Shia militias or a Shia on Sunni Arab fight. It has to be a fight of all of Iraq against extremists who do happen to be Sunni Arabs, but extremists that are wreaking havoc on a country that really had an enormous opportunity back in 2011, has made progress in certain areas, but has certainly not capitalized on that enormous opportunity in the way that we had all hoped that they would. So again, there has to be this outreach. There has to be a government that is trusted by all elements of the society. And indeed, if America is to support, then it would be in support of a government against extremists rather than one side of what could be a sectarian civil war.
Mm-hmm. David, thank you. We have to observe a hard stop at 4 o'clock, so I'm going to reflect on a series of things that we've had through a lot of the tweet questions, which reflect on this question of a US pivot to Asia, rebalancing towards Asia, and I wanted to ask John Howard to give us a perspective on that, and then I'd ask Keyu as well to just make a comment before handing it over to David.
Well, thank you. I was always a bit puzzled at the use of the word pivot towards Asia. It implied that somehow or other America had been disengaged from Asia. That hasn't been my experience. America has been very heavily engaged in Asia since World War II and fought 2 massive land wars there, and it always seemed a very odd piece of terminology. But to the extent that you set aside the terminology and you look at the manifestation of it, I am all for it. We have a simple agreement with the United States about rotating 2,500 Marines through the Northern Territory of Australia each year. Hardly a deal breaker in terms of relationships with the Chinese, although they got rather nervous about it. But I think you just ignore that sort of reaction. As I said in my opening remarks, the engagement between China and the United States will more than anything define the future of not only Asia but the rest of the world in the next 30 or 40 years. And that obviously involves a very strong American presence in Asia. America is wanted in Asia, not only by countries, old allies like Australia, but America is wanted in Asia by the Japanese, it's wanted in Asia by the Malaysians, by the Singaporeans, by everybody. And this idea that a choice has to be made between the United States and China is totally false in my view. It is possible to have close relations with both. My view is that China's growth is good not only for China but for the rest of the world. It's liberated more millions of people out of poverty than any other development since the Industrial Revolution. And so it's an overwhelmingly good thing. Speaking as an Australian, China is our best export destination by far. We have a long-term interest in having good relations with China, as well as, of course, being very close to the United States, with which we share so many common values. So I'm for the pivot. I think the Chinese will make noise about it. That is their want, but I think they understand what is on about it, and it's in everybody's interest to encourage sensible engagement between the United States and China on any issues that arise and cause conflict between them. Thank you.
Keyu, a note on the macroeconomic perspective.
Yeah, just to add a few things. I think one of my main concerns from a macroeconomic perspective is this increasing risk of turning towards protectionism in the Western world. And that is related to competition from China, but also related to the recent crisis and overall reflection about what globalization really means. But if we think about it, China and the US, as well as Asian countries and Western economies, are very different. There's comparative advantage. It's not a really direct competition end-to-end. They can share a lot of the risks. The emerging markets are relatively young. They can share demographic risk. If the emerging markets are able to procure a vast amount of wealth, they can in turn buy, purchase assets from the Western world and help support asset prices when in need. Also, China has a great pool of liquidity and very much ready to work in a globally integrated society. So I think the risks of turning towards protectionism on a wider scale is a grave danger. And it's also important to note that the second point is that the Chinese are still very much taking a pragmatic approach, and its focus, especially externally, is still very much economic, and it recognizes the fact that it's really in the interest of both sides to work together. We are, in fact, living in a global world, and the trade linkages and the financial linkages are really important. For instance, this country, China, feels that UK welcomes Chinese, especially Chinese investment and Chinese participation in owning some of the, infrastructure development, and also UK has the interest to be continually more open as China decides that some of the offshore R&B center wants to be located in the UK. Its experience with countries like in France and other countries in Europe is completely different, and US is somewhere in between. We all know the benefits of economic integration, and I just want to emphasize the point that China's view is very much still about improving the economic welfare of all sides, and it is very pragmatic. It's important to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Very good point. General David.
Yeah, I think it's important to get the terminology right. The popular term has become the Asian pivot, but it is more accurate, I think, to use the term that, in fact, the U.S. administration prefers, and that is the Asia rebalance. And indeed, that does, I think, characterize this more correctly. Because the fact is that we're not pivoting away from the Mideast and South Asia. In fact, if anything, what we've seen in recent weeks, recent months in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt, other countries in the Middle East, Yemen, in the Afghanistan and Pakistan region, and recently even in Eastern Europe with the Ukraine crisis, these all underscore the need for continued U.S. and coalition commitment and continued engagement in these areas. But clearly, Asia's importance has grown in recent decades, and it will continue to grow. And I think the rebalance is merely a formal acknowledgement of that fact. And so you do have, again, the rotation of Marines through Australia. You have greater military deployments, exercises, cooperation, and so forth. You also have the pursuit of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big trade agreement, and a variety of other diplomatic and economic initiatives as well. I would caution that we very much want to take all these actions while pursuing a constructive relationship with China. That is not always easy. There are undeniably certain elements of competition in the relationship. But we very much want to have, again, a situation in which there can be many winners and not a zero-sum game perspective, despite, frankly, the increasingly muscular actions, the muscle flexing, if you will, by China in the South and East China Seas, where it seemingly is confronting each of its maritime neighbors. And then even with the establishment of air defense identification zones that go a good bit farther than has been accepted practice in the past, and also created a challenge with even the Republic of Korea. So again, Asia clearly becoming more important, clearly does deserve greater attention in all of the different aspects of international relations, but cannot pivot away. In fact, we are drawn back continually to these other areas of the world from which there are such major threats emerging, and where we have to keep an eye very much on the particular ball.
David, thank you. I come out of this session thinking that with all the complexities that we have outlined, we're still back to, in many ways, the faith expressed by Winston Churchill, when he said that in the end, the United States always does the right thing, having explored all possible alternatives first. That's where we are, and that seems okay to me. So for now, General David Petraeus, Dr. Keyu Jin, John Howard, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
That was excellent. Thank you. That was good. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Excuse me, just before we break for tea, a couple of very, very short announcements. Firstly, can I encourage everyone to fill in the Templeton survey, which you'll find in the bottom right-hand corner of your iPads. It should only take 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes, but if you can do that over tea, that would be fantastic. The second thing is that after tea, we break into two. In the Great Hall here, we'll debate the question, has the other side won? And the chair will be Fraser Nelson. We'll see John Howard again, Jason Kenny from Canada, and Toby Young. But moving in the other direction from where you'll be having tea in the crypt, in the Livery Hall, we will be discussing He Who Pays the Piper, State Art and Liberty, with Sir Peter Bazalgette, Chair of the Arts Council, Sir Simon Jenkins, Munira Mirza, the Deputy Mayor for Education and Culture in London, Professor Roger Scruton, and Ed Vasey, the Minister for Arts. Thank you very much indeed.